pelvis. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the pelvic floor dysfunction, and specifically KEGALS, and how KEGALS a lot of times can make problems worse. So first, let's talk about the pelvic floor, because that's really what this is all about. So with the pelvic floor, we have the pelvis, right? This is a female type pelvis. You can notice how the edges go out. So in there, we have this big hole, right? So in there, there's this sling of muscles that kind of just help support what on top of that would be, your guts. So a little different male versus female. Female pelvic floor tends to be a little bit more common because us guys, we tend not to admit that we have problems in this area. But they have more stuff inside, right? Females have more stuff in there, more of the reproductive organs in there. So they have more things that are affected by pelvic floor dysfunction in terms of the number of organs. So the pelvic floor forms like a sling that holds up all of those guts, right? And so anytime there's pelvic floor dysfunction, one of the more really common exercises that are given are KEGALS, right? This is like a super common thing. So it's given for people that have pain, any kind of pelvic pain in this area, incontinence, or even something like improvement for sexual function, right? So we have all these different things. And so let's talk a little bit about KEGALS and what they are. So KEGALS are really, what they assume is that pelvic floor dysfunction comes from basically a weak muscle, right? And the pelvic floor is multiple muscles. But the Kegel exercise is essentially like you're trying to stop yourself from peeing or from pooping, right? So you have those two, what we would call sphincters. So they control things that go out of your body, right? So Kegels are intended to contract those muscles to stop those things from happening. So the problem is that only contracts those little sphincters. The pelvic floor is a whole broad sling of muscles, many more than just those two little sphincters. So it kind of ignores the fact that there's this entire floor that surrounds the sphincters. And then, ultimately it assumes that the muscles that are involved are weak and need strengthening. So the problem is that, so it assumes like this old sock phenomenon, right? So if you have an old stretched out sock, it sort of like just dangles. So that's sort of like the mentality of the KEGALS and why they're prescribed. But the other problem that we need to face is tight muscles are also weak, okay? So to give you an example, if I had you like flex your bicep really hard, right? And I had you really do that, and I want you to hold that for like 3 hours, right? How much weight do you think you'd actually be able to lift with that muscle after all that time? Probably not very much, right? So it goes back to if you have a really tight pelvic floor, it's also weak. So it's constantly in that contracted state. So if you do things like cough, sneeze, or jump, or any of these other things that a lot of people complain when there's pelvic floor dysfunction, you do any of these things and the muscles there can't actually sustain a stronger contraction against that. So it's like if I had you hold that bicep contraction for like 3 hours and then I came over here and said, okay, now hold it. And I went like that. Like you're not going to really be able to react to that. So the way the pelvic floor should function, ideally, it's this sling. It should really be like a trampoline. And if you can remember back the last time you ever jumped on a trampoline, when you're jumping around for a while and then all of a sudden you get off the trampoline, that ground, whatever it is, whether it's grass or whether you go to like a trampoline park and you step on the regular floor, it feels so hard, right? So because you're used to that bounciness on the floor. So in an ideal scenario, we want both sides of that pelvic floor to be functioning like a trampoline. That way all the stuff on top, all the guts, all the viscera, are actually able to kind of bounce around. So as you're walking or jumping or running or anything else, those organs are kind of just bouncing around and the weight is being accepted and it's bouncing back up. But unfortunately, a lot of times it's more like concrete. And oftentimes it's only one side that's like concrete. So when I evaluate a lot of pelvic floors, I'll find that it's really common that one side is sort of like soft and really kind of what you would expect to be weak, but the other side is very, very firm and it's really contracted hard. So we have this sort of discrepancy. And so we have one side that's hard like concrete and the other side that's kind of like that loose old sock sort of scenario, right? So think about what that does to the environment, to the guts that sit on top of that, right? Everything's sort of like just falling over towards that loose side and the tight side every time you're walking or jumping or bouncing or running or whatever. It's kind of pushing things harder away from that side because it's, again, like concrete. So, and what we find is both sides are weak. And what I mean by weak, I really mean like weak, because what we find is a lot of times the muscles are not really, they're not strong, but it's not because they need to be strengthened. It's really because they're inhibited. And what do I mean by that? So with inhibition, you have another structure in the body that actually shuts that particular system down. So I'll give you an example. So the pelvic ring. So let's bring back our pelvis here. So this is a movable pelvis. I can actually move this thing around. This is what your pelvis actually does. Maybe not to this degree, but it opens like this. It moves forward, backward. This is the way your body is meant to move. So the pelvic floor needs to adapt to all that. Sometimes what happens is the pelvic ring itself can actually get stuck in like a little bit of a crooked situation, all right, for one reason or another. And that is going to change the shape of that hole. It's going to change how the muscles on the inside are kind of pulled and tugged on. So you can imagine how that's going to pull on something so it makes it like kind of taut, and it's going to make other things sort of like loose and saggy, right? So kind of going back to that whole concrete versus trampoline side, you can see how that might be coming from something like the pelvic ring itself, right? Another idea is that this discrepancy can sometimes come from the guts right above it themselves. So if there's a dysfunction in the uterus or prostate or bladder or the digestive system, a lot of times that can create tensions around that area. The body kind of like hugs it and protects it, and that can create sort of like this pelvic floor. You can have one side of the pelvic floor constantly kind of trying to contract and hug that side. And you think about it, what that also does is it creates that whole discrepancy, which feeds back into this whole cycle. So like the viscera themselves may be creating this problem, but at the same time, this problem now creates problems back into the guts and the viscera, right? Does that make sense? So it can create this whole cyclical effect. And so it gets weaker and weaker and weaker, more inhibited, right? So this whole cycle can be a problem. And what KEGALS will end up doing is, because they're constantly contracting, you're constantly contracting like you're trying to hold something back. You're worried and you're focused more on tension. And the whole problem with this is that concrete side, or both sometimes, is just going to get tighter and tighter potentially. So you can see how that can actually create more and more discrepancy. So neither side is really contracting well, but the tighter side can sometimes get tighter and tighter. So we have this discrepancy that starts off just a little bit, and the more you do these contractions, sometimes we can actually create more and more tightness on the one side, whereas the other side, you're not even able to contract at all. Okay, so that's where things can get worse. So what do we do about this, right? What is the solution? So what we do is we first identify the structure or structures that could be increasing or decreasing that muscle recruitment in the pelvic floor. So whether it's being inhibited or whether it's being like really jazzed up and really excited, so we're getting that contraction on the one side, we fix that. We fix the thing that's driving the whole bus. And then what we can do is then we can go in and release the tension. So we get rid of the reason that it's like this, and then we start to regulate the muscle tension using either soft tissue techniques, or sometimes it's neuromuscular techniques. There's a bunch of different tools that we have that we basically re-regulate that both sides so that each side can actually function well. And then we rebuild the connections to the brain. So if you're inhibited, it means your brain is trying to do something to a muscle down there or several muscles, and that connection just is a little bit fuzzy. So we need to rebuild that connection. all right? Once that connection is rebuilt, the absolute last thing that we do is we think about strength. Because once you can turn something on, then you can strengthen it. Once you can turn something off and turn something on, now you can train it functionally. What I mean by that is you're doing things that are actually like regular life stuff, but you integrate that contraction with what you're doing so that it happens automatically at some point. So the end goal here is always to get you back to functioning without having to think about this stuff. It just happens automatically like it should. So to kind of wrap things up, to make this so that it's not an incredibly long video, to summarize, KEGALS, it's small muscles. It doesn't contract the whole pelvic floor, okay? And then if you're trying to strengthen something that potentially is shut down, so you're trying to get to this floor, and a lot of times you can't even get to it, and then the side that has more tension, you're potentially increasing the tension in that same side, creating more of that concrete scenario. So it won't fix much. So the best solution to sort of fix a lot of this, the pain, the incontinence, the sexual dysfunction, is to really find and fix the why, the cause, the root cause of why this whole thing happened to begin with. A lot of times it involves multiple systems, multiple structures, and it can get somewhat kind of complicated when you think about that, but that's why we love doing what we do. So everyone's a puzzle, and we have such fun unraveling it because we get to see instant results as soon as we really start uncovering that why. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you have any questions, this tends to be a topic that no one's going to really want to comment on, and I get that. That's okay, but you guys can shoot us emails or text messages at our main number. At the very least, if you're suffering from any of these issues and you've really not had success elsewhere, let us know. Come in for a consultation. We'll sit down with you one-on-one. We'll really see what it is that may be driving this for you. And it may actually become fairly obvious even in the first few minutes of us getting our hands on you and us talking to you. So a lot of times this is not that complicated to start seeing results. Very, very commonly we see it on that first visit. So if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out. And I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you found it educational, thought-provoking. If you have any ideas for any future videos, anything that you want to get our point of view on, then feel free to let us know. And I hope you guys are enjoying your day. Take care.